Hey everybody, welcome inside the sit down here on CBS Local. Ryan Mayer, now joined by Alicia Jessop. She's a sports law professor at Pepperdine University as well as a writer for The Athletic. Alicia, how are you today?
I'm great, thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to join us. And obviously, over the last couple of days and weeks here with college football, there's been a big talking point around the hashtag We Are United and hashtag We Want to Play movements and what that means for the future of organization of college athletes. Here in particular, it's college football athletes, obviously, but that can extend out to a larger group when it comes to organizing. And we've seen something like this before with Northwestern trying to organize its football team into a union. What's the difference between that attempt and this one here now in terms of the likelihood of it going through or the likelihood of it maybe not happening and some of the hurdles that may be involved?
Sure. So the difference, and it may seem obvious, but it's an important difference, is in 2014, when Northwestern football players on scholarship attempted to unionize, that was one university of 65 in the Power Five conferences. On Sunday night, the quarterback of Clemson University, Trevor Lawrence, and other top NCAA football players piqued some interest, if you will, when they tweeted this list of demands that they want to go forward with the college football season. And towards the bottom of that list was an indication that they're looking to organize or unionize. So the biggest difference is, at least on the surface, we don't really know the answer to this yet, but on the surface, it appears that this is going to be a collective effort across the Power Five conferences and those 65 schools who tend to be the top revenue generation drivers in college sport. That, though, creates this whole other avenue of legal issues because the law under which entities unionize in the United States is called the National Labor Relations Act. And that law only applies to employees of private sector employers. Well, when we look at the 65 schools in the Power Five conferences, most of those are public schools, i.e. not public sector employers. So the question then becomes, if these people are employees, that's the first hurdle you need to jump to unionize. Are these people employees? And if they are employees, who is their employer? So we could see the plausibility of these young men through their legal representatives who will come in pro bono to represent them. We see the plausibility of them raising what's called a joint employer argument, where they will assert the university is my employer, the NCAA is my employer, and this conference, the NCAA and conferences being private sector employers.
And from that standpoint, I think that's the most interesting thing to me, right? Is because before Northwestern was specifically focused on their school and their school alone. And as you mentioned in the article that you wrote for The Athletic, that presented some hurdles for the National Labor Relations Board because of that exact point. Northwestern being a private institution versus other schools being public schools, you can't have a fairness and competitive balance there that the NCAA wants, where one set of schools is offering that opportunity to unionize and another set is not able to offer that opportunity. So if they are able to figure out a way under the joint employer rule, whether it be through the conferences or through the NCAA, that seems like a path at least to having some sort of college football players association similar to what we've seen in MLB, NHL, NBA.
Possibly. So I differ from a lot of other legal scholars on this matter. There's a lot of legal scholars who are like, okay, this collective movement of all of the players in the Power Five overcomes that issue that Northwestern hit when their unionization petition went to the next level, if you will, of unionization, which is the head NLRB. So when you file a unionization petition, it starts in the regional office of the National Labor Relations Board. The National Labor Relations Board is the federal administrative agency charged with enforcing the National Labor Relations Act. So Northwestern cleared massive hurdles with their regional office, which was located in Chicago. It wasn't until they went up the chain when Northwestern University said, whoa, 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 wait a minute. We don't want our football players unionizing. It wasn't until they went up the chain to the head NLRB that entity said, we're not going to take this. We're not going to utilize our jurisdiction in this case because there's a competitive balance issue at play, since not every one of the 65 Power 5 conference schools has the right to unionize under this law. So that could all be overcome, but I don't want to get on here and send a message of like, yeah, they're going to be able to unionize because they're in a group. Because here's the key thing, Ryan, is what has changed since the 2014 attempt, other than the football players coming together? What has changed? The big thing that's changed is who's leading the National Labor Relations Board. So these are people who are appointed to their position by the President of the United States. And in 2014, the President of the United States was Barack Obama, a more union-friendly president who appointed union-friendly directors. Now our president is Donald Trump. Our president has been sued by multiple unions claiming he takes action that's arguably opposed to the National Labor Relations Act, and he has now appointed the directors of the board. So this is not a clear-cut journey for these men.
And if it's not a clear-cut journey in that sense, trying to get a more traditional union that we've become accustomed to in sports, right? As we mentioned, in the major professional sports, we see it across the board. You proposed another potential option for still organizing and negotiating these names, image, and likeness rights that we've been talking a lot about here over the past couple of years for college athletes. And I'd really love for you to explain, the way that they can still organize and yet not necessarily be a certified union in the sense of the ones that we see in professional sports.
So instinct tells me that they're going to throw a Hail Mary pass and they're going to attempt to unionize under the National Labor Relations Act. Just reading the tea leaves, if you will, I feel like that's where this is going. But let's say that they're unsuccessful in that attempt. What's going to happen? What will likely happen is the creation of a trade association. And so the trade association, these young men can be members of that trade association. And that trade association can have different responsibilities essentially for its members, one of which could be having a leader of the trade association who is responsible for negotiating, for instance, return to play protocols with the NCAA. The issue with a trade association versus a union is because of how the law works, it just doesn't have as strong as teeth as a union would, so you don't get all of the rights. But the one thing it could really help these men with, if that's what it comes to, is beginning in 2019, states around the country led by California began enacting laws basically requiring the NCAA to overturn its bylaw that prohibits college athletes from profiting off of their name, image, and likeness. In California, it's called the Fair Pay to Play Act. We've seen similar bills passed in Florida. Even our federal legislature is considering a similar bill. Well, great. The NCAA says by 2021, it's going to amend its legislation to allow college athletes to profit off of their name, image, and likeness. What does that mean? Well, on one hand, it means a college athlete and his or her mom, dad, aunt, uncle, agent can now go into the marketplace and start negotiating deals. For those of us who work in sports, we know things aren't that easy. There's not just corporations raining down saying, let me give you an endorsement deal. So the real value in a college athlete's name, image, and likeness rights comes in their ability to enter into what are called group licensing deals. Think of this as leverage or bargaining power. When you do things in groups, you tend to get a greater result. So with a group licensing deal, you could hypothetically go back to EA Sports and say, hey, we are willing to appear in your very popular, now defunct video games, but we want a portion of your profits. And so what a trade association could do is deal with the hard part of group licensing, which is getting the group together and having them all sign over their rights to the trade association to be the representative that goes out into the marketplace and finds a deal for them. So at a minimum, that's what we're going to see emerge. We were going to see that emerge before the pandemic struck, and we needed clear return to play protocols.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the pandemic striking and the effect that that has now had on this movement, right? Because it seems almost when we're talking about those return to play protocols, the players at this point have realized that, okay, we need a voice at the table in these discussions, or we should have a voice at the table in these discussions, particularly when it seems like the main reason that we're coming back to play football is to generate this money, whether it's television revenue or whatever the case is. So it's interesting to see now the players almost have a little bit more power than maybe they would have otherwise outside of the situation that we were currently in. Not that they didn't have power before, but organizing and coming together in this moment in particular seems to have only strengthened that power.
100%. If they want to do this, they need to do it now. Like, knock on wood, we do not have another pandemic in our lifetimes, and this is a once in 100 years experience. If they want to galvanize and if they want to move forward, this is the time. I think what a lot of people forget about King Coulter and the Northwestern Football Players Unionization attempt is, if you look at the petition, if you look at Kane's statements to the media, that was not a unionization attempt that was endeavored to get money for the players. So the unionization attempt came during a time where there were multiple lawsuits filed against the NCAA in an effort to get players paid more than a scholarship. That's not, at the surface, what the Northwestern unionization attempt was about. It was really about securing greater health and safety benefits for Northwestern football players. Kane was distraught that these young men played 4 years of football, succumb to multiple injuries, and then get pushed out of school upon graduation and didn't have health care benefits to maintain the level of medical care they needed to protect their bodies. And so we're seeing a similar dialogue emerge today of, whoa, wait a second, who is looking out for the college athletes' health and safety paramountly? Who in this discussion has that focus as their top focus that actually has leverage at the bargaining table? And unfortunately, despite health and safety being part of the NCAA's mission, despite there being healthcare professionals employed by every team, there's nobody at the table who can say that's my primary concern, because they're all employed by the NCAA. And so there's conflicts of interest.
For sure. And the final question that I wanted to ask you, and it relates to either one of these situations that we see happen, whether it's a union or a trade association, as you mentioned. As we look forward now, this is something we haven't ever seen necessarily in college sports. How do you, from your perspective, look at it in terms of how it changes the sport going forward from this standpoint?
We have been on a path for the last decade of a changing NCAA. So what is the NCAA? The NCAA is higher education. And I'm a full-time tenure track professor. I would say this to my boss. My boss knows this. Higher education is notoriously slow when it comes to change. And so this has been moving at a snail's pace. And now we have a global pandemic that's forcing the change to come. It's what we're seeing across our society with race relations, with discussion on healthcare, discussion on our economy. What does our political structure look like in 4 months? Is all of the conversations that are going on in mainstream society, but now they're taking place in a microcosm, and the microcosm is college sports. So what does college sports look like after COVID-19? I would like to tell you, oh, it's going to be completely different. The players' health and safety is going to be a paramount concern. We're only going to schedule games on weekends so they can go to school. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. I think what will happen is you have certain athletes that recognize there's power and value behind their voice. They recognize that they do not need to wait to be a professional to exercise that voice. One thing I would really like to see emerge from this is the creation of an independent medical council who is not paid for by the NCAA, but reviews return to play protocols and reviews not just return to play protocols for pandemics, But whenever a player is
Right.
injured, whether it be an ACL tear or a concussion or hamstring strain, I think that's something that needs to occur. And we need to continue having a conversation about the financial impact of college sports versus the value proposition that college athletes receive in a scholarship. Scholarships are very valuable. There's many American families feeling the pinch during COVID-19 who would love nothing more than a full tuition scholarship for their child. But we have to examine whether college athletes are actually getting the full value of that scholarship when they are spending 60 plus hours per week on sport related activities. So the big changes I hope for are more effective athlete centric and athlete focused healthcare, and then a real open, honest discussion on what is the value of an athletic scholarship, and are these college athletes actually capturing and engaging in the same educational experience as the band geek or the normal non-athletic student.
For sure. Alicia Jessop, thank you so much for joining us. You can check out her work at The Athletic, and stay safe, stay well. Till we talk next time.
Thank you. Take care.